The morning my brother handed me a document to sign, he was smiling. He had been smiling at me like that for 30 years. I did not sign. I had driven back to the farm for the first time in 4 years because our mother was gone. Ruth Voss, who kept the original deed to that land, folded inside a coffee tin on the second shelf of her kitchen cabinet. She kept it there because she said paper is only as safe as the person who holds it. I thought about that the moment I pulled into the driveway and saw the equipment shed. The one my father built by hand over 2 summers, was simply gone. A newer structure stood in its place. Gerald's name was still on the permit sign nailed to the post, weathered but readable. I walked through the farmhouse. New kitchen. New floors. 30 years of quarterly reports had told me the farm was doing fine, breaking even most years, nothing to worry about. Yet somehow there was money enough for all of this. I asked Gerald when the renovation happened. He said he had reinvested profits. I asked to see the accounts. He said he would send them. He never sent them. 3 days later he called, easy and warm, and told me he had a simple document, just a small thing, really, to clean up the ownership structure. For my benefit, he said. He would bring it to the estate meeting. I went home and opened a box I had kept in my closet for 30 years. I had never planned to use what was inside it. I had kept it the way my mother kept that deed, because some part of me understood that things which matter should be held on to. What I found inside that box is what I want to tell you about. The box was not dramatic. It was a shoebox, actually, one of those old ones with the thin cardboard lid that bends when you press it. I had moved it from apartment to apartment, from my place in Columbus to the house in Cincinnati, and then to where I live now. 30 years. I never once opened it with any intention. I opened it the way you check on something you've stored, not because you expect to find anything, but because you remember it's there. Inside, rubber-banded stacks of paper. Cancelled checks from my parents, dated back to 1994. Every quarterly report Gerald had ever mailed me, printed on plain white paper, his handwriting in the totals column. My own notes in the margins, small, penciled questions I had written and then apparently decided not to ask. Numbers that seemed low. Yields that seemed off for a farm that size. I had noticed and then let it go, the way you let go of something when you trust the person holding it. I spread the first stack across my kitchen table and sat down. The farm was 214 acres in central Ohio. My father, Robert Voss, had bought the first 80 acres in 1961 with money he saved working road construction for 6 years. He added parcels over the following decade, piece by piece, the way men of that generation built things, slowly, without fanfare, without borrowing more than they could repay in a single harvest. By the time I was born, the farm was already something. By the time I left for work at 32, it was worth considerably more than either of my parents ever said out loud. The arrangement Gerald and I made was simple. He would manage the operation. I would receive my half of any net income, paid quarterly. We shook hands. We did not hire a lawyer. Our parents were still alive, the farm was still theirs in name, and it genuinely did not occur to me, that a handshake with my brother required documentation. Gerald had been managing the farm for 2 years by then, and he was good at it. He knew the equipment, knew the neighbors, knew which fields drained well and which ones held water too long in spring. I knew spreadsheets. I knew conference rooms. I had moved to Columbus for a job in hospital administration and I was building something of my own, and Gerald seemed to understand that, and we found an arrangement that suited us both. Or so I believed. For 30 years, the quarterly reports came. Some years the numbers were modest. Gerald always had a reason, a wet spring, a machinery repair, commodity prices dropping. I accepted every explanation because I had no reason not to. He was my brother. He was on the ground. He knew things I didn't know, and I had chosen, deliberately, to be 3 states away. What I had not chosen was to be deceived. I pulled the county auditor's records that night. They are public documents, anyone can access them, and I do not know why it had never occurred to me to look before. Perhaps because Gerald's reports had always arrived so reliably, so neatly formatted, that I had mistaken presentation for truth. The auditor's records showed assessed valuations, crop yields filed for subsidy purposes, and several years of property improvement permits. I cross-referenced them against Gerald's quarterly reports, year by year, starting with the most recent and working backward. The first discrepancy I found was in 2019. Not enormous, but clear. The farm's documented yield that year, filed with the county for federal crop insurance, was significantly higher than what Gerald's report to me reflected as net income. I wrote the number on a notepad and kept reading. By the time I reached 2011, I had filled 2 pages. I called Arthur Keene the next morning. Arthur had handled my parents' original estate planning back in 2001, and he had said something to me then that I had never forgotten. He was walking me through the documents, explaining how the farm ownership would pass, and at the end he said, almost as an aside, "Eleanor, keep everything. Every check, every letter, every report. Keep it even when you think you don't need it. Especially then." I had thought he was being cautious in the way attorneys are cautious by profession. I had not understood that he was giving me specific advice about a specific risk. Arthur answered on the 3rd ring. He is 71 now and semi-retired, but his voice is the same, careful, unhurried, the kind of voice that does not alarm you even when the information it carries should. I told him what I had found. I told him about the permit sign still nailed to the post with Gerald's name on it. I told him about the new kitchen, the new floors, the equipment shed that no longer existed. I told him Gerald had promised to send the accounts and had not sent them. I told him about the document Gerald was planning to bring to the estate meeting, the one that would, as Gerald put it, clean up the ownership structure. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor, do not sign anything. Bring me the folder." I told him it wasn't exactly a folder. He said to bring it anyway. I put everything back in the shoebox, added the pages of county records I had printed, and drove to Arthur's office the following Tuesday with a box held together by a lid that didn't quite close. What Arthur found inside that box over the next 2 weeks is what changed everything. But I want to tell you something first, something I have thought about many times since that night at my kitchen table, surrounded by 30 years of paper. I had kept all of it without knowing why. I had moved it across 3 addresses and never once opened it with any purpose. And yet some part of me had known. Some quiet, patient part of me had understood that the day might come when the paper would matter more than the trust. Gerald had counted on the trust. He had never once considered the paper. That was his first mistake. And when Arthur called me 2 weeks later with a number, the actual number, the sum of what the records suggested I had never received, I understood that it was also his last. Arthur Keene's office smelled the way old law offices always smell, like paper that has been important for a long time. He had a desk lamp that threw a yellow circle of light, and he sat inside that circle for 2 weeks while he went through my box. I did not sit with him. He called me when he had something to say. The first call came on a Thursday. He asked me to confirm the dates on 3 of the quarterly reports, the ones from 2009, 2011, and 2013. I confirmed them. He thanked me and said he would call again. The second call came the following Monday. He asked whether I had ever received any documentation of capital improvements to the property, permits, contractor invoices, Anything that showed work had been done and who had authorized it. I told him I had not. He said, "That's what I expected." Then he said he would need a few more days. I want to tell you what I did during those days, because I think it matters. I did not call Gerald. I did not call Diane. I did not tell anyone in the family what I had found or what Arthur was doing. I went home, I watered my plants, I cooked simple meals, and I waited. I had waited 30 years. I could wait 2 more weeks. But I will not pretend those 2 weeks were easy. At night, when the house was quiet, I would sit at my kitchen table and think about the man I had grown up with. Gerald at 10 years old, following our father across the fields in boots that were too big for him. Gerald at our mother's table, eating the same meals I ate, raised by the same 2 people who told us both that family was the only thing that lasts. I thought about the moment he must have made a decision. Because it was a decision, I understood that now. It was not drift. It was not carelessness. At some point, Gerald had looked at the distance between us and decided it was wide enough to work with. I kept coming back to one question. Not how much. Not even how long. The question I kept returning to was simpler than that. Did he ever think I would find out? Arthur answered that question on the day he called me in. I drove to his office on a Tuesday morning. The box was already open on his desk, and he had arranged its contents into 3 separate stacks, each held together with a binder clip. He had also added his own papers to each stack, printed records, handwritten notes in his careful, deliberate script. He walked me through the first stack. Underpaid distributions. He had cross-referenced my quarterly reports against the county tax records I had pulled, the ones that showed what the farm had actually earned in those years. The gap was not a rounding error. In some years, I had received less than half of what the records suggested my share should have been. Across the years he had been able to document clearly, the total was significant. He told me the number. I asked him to say it again. He did. I looked at the second stack. Capital improvements. Gerald had used farm operating accounts that held income from land I co-owned, to fund renovations to the farmhouse and to construct the new equipment building. The building with his name on the permit sign. The kitchen my mother had never seen finished. The floors I had walked across not knowing I had helped pay for them. Those improvements had increased the property's appraised value. Gerald's equity had grown. Mine had not in any way I had been told about or consented to. I was quiet for a moment. Arthur let me be quiet. Then he picked up the third stack. It was thinner than the others. Just a few pages, and a small digital recorder. He said, "Eleanor, I want to prepare you before I play this." I told him I didn't need to be prepared. I had been preparing for 30 years without knowing it. He pressed play. It was Gerald's voice. Recorded in 2014, on a voicemail he had left for Diane. He had dialed the wrong number, my number, not hers. He had not noticed. He spoke for 47 seconds. He talked about the farm, about the accounts, about a decision he had made about that year's distribution. And then, near the end, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Ellie never checks. She never will." 7 words. Said the way you say something you stopped questioning a long time ago. Said the way you say something that has simply become true, like the weather or the price of grain. I had listened to that voicemail once before, in 2014. I had not understood what I was hearing. I had thought it was a mistake, a call meant for someone else, a fragment of a conversation I wasn't supposed to have. I had saved it to my digital recorder the way I saved everything, without purpose, without plan. Now I understood exactly what I had heard. I sat in Arthur's office and I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, because I think some people expect a woman in that moment to cry. I did not cry. I felt something colder than grief and steadier than anger. I felt the specific sensation of a thing becoming true that you had suspected for a long time but had never allowed yourself to fully believe. Gerald had not drifted into this. He had not made a series of small, careless mistakes that accumulated over time. He had made a calculation. He had looked at his sister, the one who lived 3 states away, the one who never made trouble, the one who said "I trust you, Gerald," and meant it, and he had decided she was safe to take from. He had been right for 30 years. I looked at Arthur. I said, "I want to know the exact total. Everything, the distributions, the improvements, all of it." Arthur told me the number. The full number, with everything included. I closed the folder. I set my hands flat on the desk. And I said, "Then I'll bring it to the meeting." Arthur looked at me for a moment. Then he said something I have not forgotten. He said, "Eleanor, in 40 years of practice, I have not seen documentation this organized from someone who wasn't a lawyer." I told him I wasn't a lawyer. I was just a woman who kept things. He said, "That's exactly what this is." The estate meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Gerald had already confirmed he would be there. He had called me the week before, cheerful, easy, already talking about what came next, what we would do with the property, how the transition would be smooth, how it was really just paperwork. I told him I looked forward to seeing him. I did not tell him what I would be bringing. That night, I sat at my kitchen table one more time. The box was in my car. Arthur had organized its contents into a single folder, a proper one, with tabs, with a summary page he had prepared at the front. The summary listed 3 categories. It listed the total. It listed, word for word, the transcript of the 47-second voicemail. I thought about my mother. I thought about the coffee tin where she kept the deed, on the shelf above the refrigerator, in the kitchen that no longer existed in the form she had left it. She had kept that deed because she understood that paper outlasts everything, outlasts memory, outlasts goodwill, outlasts the stories people tell themselves about who they are. I had kept my paper for the same reason, even when I didn't know that was the reason. Gerald had counted on 30 years of silence. What he didn't know, what he could not have imagined, because he had never once thought to look, was that the silence had not been empty. I had been filling it, 1 page at a time, for 30 years. And when I walked into that meeting room on Thursday morning and set my folder on the table, Gerald was already smiling. He had his document in front of him. He had his pen ready. He looked at me the way he had looked at me for 30 years, like someone who already knew how the conversation was going to end. He did not yet know that I was the one who had decided how it would end. He did not yet know what was inside that folder. But he was about to find out. I set my folder on the table at 8:53 in the morning. Gerald set his document on the table at 8:54. He was smiling. Of course he was smiling. He had been smiling since I pulled into the driveway that morning, that particular smile, the one that said "This is already settled, Ellie, let's not make it complicated." He had his attorney beside him, a man named Cartwright who wore a good suit and did not make eye contact with me when I walked in. Arthur was beside me. The room smelled like old coffee and central heating. There was a window that looked out over the parking lot. None of it mattered. What mattered was the folder. Gerald slid his document toward me. A pen followed it. I looked at the document. I looked at the pen. And then I opened my folder and slid it across the table to him. I said, "I'd like you to look at this before I sign anything. I want to tell you what Arthur had found. Because it matters. It matters that the numbers were real, that the paper was real, that 30 years of quiet attention produced something that could sit in a room and speak for itself. The first category, underpaid distributions. Across at least 12 years that Arthur could document directly from the county tax records and my own cancelled checks, my share of the farm's income had been shorted. Not by rounding errors. Not by bad harvests. The farm had earned what the tax records said it earned. My distributions did not reflect that. The difference, across 12 years, was not a small number. Arthur had written it at the top of the summary page, in plain figures, with no commentary. The number did not need commentary. The second category, capital improvements. The new equipment structure. The renovated kitchen. The floors. Gerald had paid for all of it from the farm's operating accounts that were, legally, jointly held assets of both of us. Every improvement he made increased the property's value. Every dollar of that increased value belonged, in part, to me. He had been building equity in a property he intended to take, using money that was partly mine, without my knowledge and without my consent. The third category was 1 page long. It was the transcript of a 47-second voicemail. Ellie never checks. She never will. Gerald opened the folder. He read the summary page. I watched his face. I have thought about that moment many times since. I have tried to find the right words for what I saw. It was not panic. It was not anger, not yet. It was something quieter than either of those things, a kind of stillness, the way a room goes still when something has been dropped and hasn't hit the floor yet. His attorney leaned over and read the summary page as well. He straightened up slowly. He did not say anything. Gerald turned to the second page. Then the third. He found the voicemail transcript near the back, behind Arthur's documentation of the capital improvements. I know the moment he reached it because his hand stopped moving. He held the page for a long time. Then he said, This is not what it looks like. I had waited 30 years to hear him explain what it looked like. I said, I know what it looks like. I've had 30 years to look at it. Here is the thing I did not expect. Diane left the room. She had been sitting in the corner, not at the table, but in a chair against the wall, the way someone sits when they want to be present without being accountable. She had said nothing since I arrived. When Gerald said this is not what it looks like, Diane stood up, picked up her handbag, and walked out of the room. She did not look at Gerald when she left. She did not look at me. I understood, in that moment, that Diane had always known. She had known the way people know things they have decided not to examine, not ignorance, but a careful arrangement of attention, a practiced habit of looking at the parts of a situation that were comfortable and turning away from the parts that were not. When Gerald said Ellie never checks, she never will, Diane had been in the room. She had heard it. She had said nothing. She had benefited from everything that followed. And now that the folder was open, she walked out of the room rather than be named inside it. I watched her go. I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, something colder than both. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of a pattern finally seen in full. Gerald's attorney asked for a recess. Arthur said, Of course. In the hallway, while Gerald and Cartwright conferred behind a closed door, Arthur stood beside me and said nothing for a while. Then he said, You understand what happens next. I said I did. He said, It will not be fast. These things are never fast. He will push back. Cartwright will find angles. You need to be prepared to hold. I told him I had been holding for 30 years. A few more months was not going to be the thing that broke me. Arthur looked at me for a moment. He is a careful man, careful with his words, careful with his expressions. But something moved across his face then that I recognized as close to pride. He said, "Eleanor." The voicemail alone would have been enough. "But you gave me 30 years of paper to put around it." There is not a version of this where Gerald wins. I thought about my mother. I thought about the coffee tin on the shelf above the refrigerator. I thought about the deed she kept inside it, folded in thirds, because she said paper is only as safe as the person who holds it. I had held my paper for 30 years. Gerald had spent 30 years counting on the silence. What he had never understood, what he could not have understood, because understanding it would have required him to see me as someone worth understanding, was that the silence had never been surrender. It had been storage. And now the folder was open on the table, and Cartwright was behind a closed door trying to find a way out of it, and Gerald's transfer document was still sitting in front of my empty chair, unsigned. When the door opened and they came back into the room, Gerald's smile was gone. Not all at once. The way heat leaves a room, slowly, then completely. He sat down. He looked at the folder. He looked at me. And I thought, he is finally seeing me. After 30 years, he is finally looking at me and seeing someone he did not account for. I waited. Because I had learned, over 30 years, that waiting is not weakness. Sometimes waiting is the whole strategy. And the audit request Arthur had filed that morning, the one Gerald did not yet know about, the one that would take the next 4 months to complete, was already in motion. The number at the top of Arthur's summary page was about to become a legal obligation. Gerald just didn't know it yet. Gerald looked at the folder. Not at me. At the folder. His attorney, Cartwright, had come back into the room with the careful, neutral expression of a man who had just read something he wished he hadn't. Gerald sat beside him. Diane was in the chair nearest the door, which I noticed. She had positioned herself closest to the exit before she even sat down. Gerald's transfer document was still on the table in front of my empty chair. The pen beside it. Neither had moved. I had not moved either. Gerald turned to the first page of Arthur's summary. I watched his eyes go still. Not the stillness of a man thinking, the stillness of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath him is no longer solid. He said, this is not what it looks like." I had waited 30 years for him to say something true in that room. That was not it. I said, "I know what it looks like. I've had 30 years to look at it." He looked up at me then. Really looked. And I understood something in that moment that I had not fully understood before. Gerald had genuinely believed I would never be in this room. Not this version of this room, with Arthur beside me and a filed audit request already in motion and 30 years of paper organized into categories with tabs. He had built his entire arrangement on a version of me that had stopped existing the day Arthur Keene told me to keep everything. He had been managing a ghost. The woman sitting across from him was someone else entirely. Cartwright leaned over and said something quietly to Gerald. Gerald shook his head once. Then he said, "To no one in particular, I managed that farm for 30 years. I was there. She wasn't." Arthur said, very calmly, "That's noted. The audit will account for the value of management services. It will also account for the distributions that were not paid, the capital improvements that were not disclosed, and the voicemail from October 2014. All of that will be part of the record." Gerald did not speak again for a long time. Diane picked up her bag and set it in her lap. I looked at the transfer document one more time. The one he had brought to simplify things. The one that would have given him everything and left me with a signature I could never take back. I left it on the table, and signed. The audit took 4 months. I will not walk you through every page of it, that is not the story. The story is what the pages added up to. The settlement was reached on a Tuesday in October, in a room I was not present for. Arthur called me when it was done. He told me the number. I wrote it down on the same notepad I had used to write down discrepancies in Gerald's quarterly reports for 30 years. The number was not small. It was, in Arthur's words, a fair accounting of what was owed. Gerald did not contest it. I think by then he understood that contesting it would only require him to explain, in open court, why he had said what he said in that voicemail. Some things are better settled quietly. He had spent 30 years counting on my quiet. In the end, his own quiet cost him more. I sold my half of the farm 3 months after the settlement. I sold it to the Hendersons, a family who had farmed the land adjacent to ours for 40 years. Their grandfather had helped my father clear the east field the first winter my parents owned the property. My mother had known their mother. They were people who understood what the land was, not just what it was worth. I did not ask Gerald's opinion. I did not need to. My mother kept the deed in a coffee tin on the shelf above the refrigerator. She kept it there because she said paper is only as safe as the person who holds it. I kept 30 years of paper in a box in my closet because I understood, somewhere in the part of me that remembered her saying that the day might come when I would need to be the person holding it. I was right. I just didn't know it would take 30 years for someone to hand me a pen. What I know now, what I wish I had known when I was 32 and trusting and 3 states away, is that the women in our families who are quiet are not always the ones who have nothing to say. Sometimes they are the ones who are waiting until what they say cannot be ignored. I was one of those women. I do not know how many others there are. But I think about the coffee tin. I think about my mother folding that deed in thirds and placing it inside, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that the things that matter most require someone who takes them seriously enough to keep them safe. She kept the deed. I kept the paper. And when the moment came, the paper was enough. Gerald's name was removed from the deed on a Wednesday. I did not watch it happen. I did not need to witness it to know it was real. Some things do not require you to be in the room. They only required you to do the work, years before, when no one was watching and no one thought it mattered. I did the work. That is the whole story. There is one thing I have not told you. The coffee tin, the one my mother kept the deed in, was still on that shelf when I walked through the farmhouse after the settlement. Gerald had renovated the kitchen. New counters, new floors, new cabinets. But the shelf above the refrigerator was still there. And the tin was still on it. Empty, of course. I took it with me. It sits on my kitchen shelf now. I have not decided what to put in it yet. My question for you is this: is there something you have been keeping, some record, some paper, some quiet knowledge, that you have never known what to do with?